Have you ever heard the story of a single piece of bread that changed two lives forever? It happened in a small town, the kind of place where streets are lined with dusty cobblestones, and every face is a familiar one except, of course, for strangers. And one cold winter morning, a stranger did appear. His coat was torn, his shoes worn thin, and in his eyes was that look you sometimes see in people who have walked too far without finding what they need: hunger, both for food and for something more. On the edge of the marketplace stood a small bakery, its windows fogged with the warmth of fresh bread inside. That is where Thomas worked every day, shaping dough with careful hands. His life was simple, his earnings modest, but he always took pride in making something that brought comfort to others. That morning, he noticed the man outside, not moving toward the door, just standing in the wind, watching loaves being carried out by happy customers. Thomas had already sold most of his bread. Only one loaf remained on the counter, a small, round loaf, still warm from the oven. It was meant for his own supper. He thought about the long hours he'd worked, the wood he had chopped to heat the oven, and how empty his own cupboard was at home. And then his eyes met the stranger's again. There are moments in life when you feel a quiet voice inside say, "This is your chance." You might think that giving away something so small could hardly matter, but have you ever noticed how the smallest gestures stay in someone's memory the longest? Thomas walked to the door, bread in hand, and stepped into the cold. He didn't speak much, just held out the loaf. The stranger's hands trembled as he took it, like it was the first warmth he'd felt in days. That day, Thomas went home with an empty bag, but a strangely full heart. What he didn't know was that this act, this simple choice, would not be forgotten. The wind carried the scent of bread down the street, but something else lingered in the air too, a seed of kindness planted in the cold, waiting to grow. The next day began like any other. The sun rose pale and slow, its light stretching over the rooftops, and Thomas was already at the bakery before the first bell rang in the church tower. He kneaded the dough, dusted the counter with flour, and set the ovens to glow. But even as he worked, his mind kept wandering back to the man from yesterday. Would he ever see him again? Or had the stranger simply taken the bread and disappeared into the endless road? Outside, the town moved at its usual pace, vendors calling out prices, children chasing one another down the narrow lanes. Yet in the middle of all this familiar life, there was an air of expectancy, as if something unseen had shifted. You felt that before, haven't you? When a small act changes the way you look at your own routine, making the ordinary feel like it's holding its breath. Around midday, Thomas stepped outside to deliver bread to a nearby inn. That's when he noticed a small bundle on the bakery's doorstep. Wrapped in brown paper, tied with a simple string, it sat quietly against the wall. He bent down and picked it up. Inside was a note written in uneven letters and a small pouch of coins, more than he would earn in a week. The note read, "Your bread saved my life. I was a traveler with nothing left and no hope. I will not forget you." Thomas stood there, the sounds of the market fading into a soft hum. This wasn't just payment for bread, it was gratitude poured into every letter. He imagined the man writing it somewhere warm, his hunger eased, perhaps even finding the strength to take his next step in life. And Thomas wondered, how many times had he passed by someone who needed help without noticing? That evening, he didn't close the bakery right away. Instead, he sat by the window, watching people pass. He began to see them differently, not as customers or strangers, but as stories walking by, each carrying struggles and dreams he couldn't see at first glance. And in his heart, he knew this. The bread had been only the beginning. Days turned into weeks, and winter deepened. Frost clung to the windows each morning, and the air smelled faintly of smoke from the chimneys lining the narrow streets. Thomas continued baking, each loaf shaped with the same care as before, but something had changed in him. That one moment, standing in the cold with a loaf in his hands, had awakened a kind of awareness he hadn't felt in years. It's strange, isn't it? How a single choice can open your eyes to the quiet needs all around you. Once you've seen them, you can't unsee them. Now, Every face that passed his bakery seemed to carry a question. What would happen if you offered them just a little more than they expected? One evening, as the sun melted into a copper horizon, an old woman stopped by. Her scarf was frayed, her hands stiff with cold. She placed a few small coins on the counter, barely enough for a crust. Thomas glanced at the money, then at her eyes, tired, but still holding a flicker of pride. Without a word, he wrapped a full loaf in paper and slid it across the counter. "For your supper," he said simply. She hesitated. "I can't pay for this." "You already have," Thomas replied, nodding toward her coins. "And that's enough." As she left, holding the bread like it was gold, Thomas felt that same quiet warmth he had felt the day he met the stranger. This warmth had nothing to do with the ovens. It was the kind that seeps into your bones when you know you've done something that matters. Word began to spread, though Thomas never spoke of his small acts. People in the town started visiting the bakery not just for bread, but for the feeling they carried away with it, like the scent of fresh loaves. It lingered. And sometimes, on cold mornings, Thomas would glance at the doorway, half expecting to see the traveler again, walking in with that same look of need. He didn't know yet that their paths were destined to cross again, and when they did, it wouldn't just be another act of kindness, it would be a turning point neither man could have predicted. It happened on a late winter afternoon, the kind when the sky feels heavy, pressing low over the rooftops, and the streets are quieter than usual. Thomas was sweeping the bakery floor, the warm scent of fresh bread wrapping the room in comfort, when the door creaked open. A man stepped inside, shaking snow from his shoulders. His coat was no longer torn, his shoes no longer thin, and there was a steadiness in his posture that spoke of strength regained. But his eyes, yes, Thomas knew those eyes. The same deep-set gaze he had met weeks ago, when hunger and cold had etched lines of desperation across the stranger's face. For a moment, neither spoke. The man smiled slow, almost shy, and walked toward the counter. "You may not remember me," he began. Thomas interrupted with a gentle laugh. "I remember." The man placed a small leather satchel on the counter. "I came back because I wanted to thank you properly. That day, you gave me bread when I had nothing. I was on my way to find work, but I hadn't eaten in 2 days. That loaf kept me moving, and because of it, I reached the next town. I found a job. I found a place to sleep." He pushed the satchel closer. "Inside is enough to keep your bakery warm for the winter. I know money can't repay kindness, but I hope it helps you help others." Thomas hesitated. It wasn't the amount, though. It was generous. It was the way the man looked at him, as if passing back not just coins, but dignity restored. "I didn't give you bread expecting anything in return," Thomas said quietly. "I know," the man replied. "That's why it mattered." Outside, the snow continued to fall, soft and steady, as if the world itself wanted to muffle every sound except this moment. Thomas thought about all the faces that had passed his door since that day, each one carrying their own untold story. How many more chances would he have to offer something small, yet life-changing? And you, if you were standing there, seeing the man return with gratitude shining in his eyes, would you start to notice, in your own life, the strangers who might only need one act of kindness to change their path? Spring came slowly, with the ice retreating from the edges of the cobblestone streets and the first green shoots daring to push through the thawed earth. The bakery door stayed open more often now, letting in the scent of fresh air and the distant sound of children laughing in the square. But inside, something deeper had taken root, an unspoken agreement between Thomas and the townspeople that kindness was as essential as bread itself. The traveler whose name Thomas now knew was Daniel became a familiar figure in town. He didn't speak often of his past, but his actions told a new story. Some mornings, Thomas would find him helping the grocer carry crates, or mending the fence outside the school. On market days, he'd stop by the bakery not to buy, but to help sweep the floor or carry loaves to the elderly who couldn't make the walk themselves. It's strange, isn't it, how one gift given freely can ripple outward, touching lives you never imagined. You might think kindness is a single act, But in truth, it's a seed. It grows in the one who receives it, and then it blooms in the lives they touch afterward. One afternoon, as Thomas was arranging loaves in the window, a young boy stood outside watching intently. His clothes were patched, his shoes too thin for the season. Thomas opened the door. "Would you like a warm roll?" The boy nodded but kept his eyes lowered. Thomas placed the roll in his small hands, its steam curling upward into the cool air. "No charge," he said softly. "Just promise me this. One day, when you can, pass it on to someone else." Daniel, who had been stacking baskets nearby, caught Thomas's eye. There was no need for words between them. They both understood they were keeping the chain alive. By the time the sun dipped low, painting the town in amber light, the bakery was quiet again. Thomas leaned against the counter, looking at the empty trays. Not a single loaf left. But his heart felt full in a way that didn't come from sales or coins. It came from knowing that somewhere out there, another small story had just begun, perhaps with a boy holding a warm roll, wondering how far such a small kindness could travel. Summer arrived with long golden evenings, the kind where light lingers on every rooftop and laughter drifts lazily through the air. The bakery door stayed propped open, letting the scent of fresh bread mix with the smell of blooming flowers from the market stalls outside. Life in the small town moved at its steady pace, but within that rhythm, something had subtly shifted. People had started noticing each other more, pausing to help, to smile, to ask how someone was doing. One warm afternoon, a woman entered the bakery carrying a basket of apples. She placed them on the counter. "These are from my orchard," she said. "For all those you've helped." She glanced at Daniel, who was arranging loaves in neat rows. "Word gets around." Thomas smiled, tucking the apples into a wooden bowl by the window. He didn't keep count anymore, not of loaves given away, not of favors done, not of coins left in gratitude. The giving had become part of the day, like kneading the dough or lighting the oven in the morning. And the town had begun to mirror that. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in shades of rose and amber, Thomas locked the bakery and stepped into the quiet street. Daniel joined him, carrying a small cloth-wrapped bundle. They walked to the edge of town where the road forked, one path leading to the fields, the other toward the river. Daniel stopped and handed Thomas the bundle. Inside was a loaf of bread, still warm. "For you," Daniel said simply. "Because I remember." Thomas looked at him for a long moment, the evening air soft around them. "And I remember too," he said. They stood there in silence, two men bound not by debt, but by a thread of humanity spun from one small act in the cold of winter. Around them, fireflies began to glow in the fading light, tiny sparks against the darkening sky. In the end, the smallest act of kindness was the one that changed everything.